The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, but Frank Xavier refused to stop working even as his hands shook on the fence posts and his vision blurred in the harsh Montana sun. His ranch stretched across 200 acres of unforgiving land outside Butte, where copper mines had made some men rich but left ranchers like him fighting against drought, harsh winters, and soil that seemed determined to reject every seed he planted. He had inherited this land from his father 2 years ago in 1883, and he would be damned if he let it die on his watch, even if keeping it alive meant working himself into an early grave. The cattle lowed in the distance, their ribs showing through their hides despite Frank's best efforts to keep them fed. The creek that ran through his property had slowed to a trickle during the summer drought, and he had spent the last month digging a new well by hand, 20 feet down into stubborn rock and clay. His shoulders screamed with every movement. His back felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through it, and the fever made everything shimmer and dance at the edges of his vision. But he kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging that he might actually lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. He was 26 years old and felt twice that age. His dark hair hung past his collar, unwashed for days, and his face bore the gaunt hollows of a man who forgot to eat more often than he remembered. The mirror in his cabin showed someone he barely recognized anymore, all sharp angles and shadowed eyes, skin burned dark by the sun except where fever had painted his cheeks an unnatural red. The fence post he was trying to set suddenly tilted sideways, or maybe he did. Frank found himself on his knees in the dirt, the world spinning around him like a child's top. He tried to stand, got halfway up, and then the ground rushed up to meet him, and everything went black. He woke to the sound of wheels crunching on the dry road that led to his property. For a moment he thought he might be dreaming or dead, because nobody came out this far unless they had business with him, and he had no business with anyone. Frank tried to lift his head and managed only to turn it slightly enough to see a wagon approaching, pulled by 2 sturdy horses that looked better fed than his entire herd. The driver was a woman, which was his second shock of the morning. She sat straight-backed on the bench wearing a practical brown traveling dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. As the wagon drew closer, he could make out more details through his fever-addled vision. She had dark blonde hair pinned up in a neat arrangement, and she handled the reins with the confidence of someone who had driven 1,000 miles and could drive 1,000 more without breaking a sweat. She pulled the horses to a stop about 10 feet from where he lay sprawled in the dirt like a drunk outside a saloon. For a long moment she just sat there looking at him, and Frank felt a flush of shame that had nothing to do with the fever. What kind of picture must he make, lying in his own yard like refuse? "Are you dead?" she called out, her voice clear and practical with a hint of East Coast refinement that seemed entirely out of place in the Montana wilderness. "Not yet," Frank managed to croak out, though it took more effort than it should have. She set the brake and climbed down from the wagon with efficient movements, gathering her skirts to keep them out of the dirt. As she approached, he could see that she was probably close to his own age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with intelligent gray eyes that assessed him the way a doctor might assess a patient or a horse trader might assess livestock. It was not an entirely comfortable feeling, but he lacked the strength to object. "You look terrible," she announced, crouching down beside him. She pressed the back of her hand against his forehead, and even through his fever he could feel that her skin was blessedly cool. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "What day is it?" Frank asked. "Thursday." He tried to remember. "Sunday, maybe Saturday." "And when did you last sleep for more than a few hours?" "I sleep." "That was not what I asked." She stood and looked around at his property, taking in the half-finished well, the sagging fences, the barn that needed new shingles, the cattle that were too thin, the fields where crops struggled against the dry soil. Her expression remained neutral, but he saw her lips pressed together in a thin line. "You have been working yourself to death." "Land does not care if I'm tired," Frank said. He tried again to sit up and this time managed it, though the world swam sickeningly around him. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "My name is Margaret Brennan," she said. "I was traveling through from Helena to Butte when I saw you collapse. I am a nurse. I trained at Bellevue Hospital in New York City before coming west last year." She said this matter-of-factly, as though women routinely traveled alone through Montana territory and stopped to help strange men on failing ranches. "A nurse," Frank repeated stupidly. His mind felt like it was moving through molasses. "What are you doing out here?" "At this precise moment, I'm keeping you from dying of fever and exhaustion in your own front yard," Margaret said. "The larger question of what I'm doing in Montana is a longer story, and you are in no condition to hear it. Can you walk?" "Of course I can walk," Frank said, offended. He tried to prove it by standing up. He made it about 3 seconds on his feet before his knees buckled. Margaret caught him with surprising strength, getting her shoulder under his arm and bearing his weight without complaint. She was taller than he had initially thought, perhaps 5'7", and clearly stronger than her refined appearance suggested. "Your cabin is that building there, I assume?" she asked, nodding toward the small log structure his grandfather had built decades ago. "I do not need help," Frank protested weakly, "and I do not need to be here. But we rarely get what we need in this life, only what we are given," Margaret said. "Now walk, or I will leave you here for the crows." The threat was ridiculous, but somehow effective. Frank stumbled forward, leaning heavily on this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere like something from a fever dream. Each step felt like a mile, but eventually they reached the cabin. Margaret pushed open the door with her hip and half dragged him inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly what one would expect from a man living alone and working himself to death. Dirty dishes were stacked in the wash basin, clothes hung over chairs. His bed looked like he had simply fallen into it without bothering with sheets, and a thin layer of dust covered every surface. Frank felt another wave of shame wash over him, but Margaret simply guided him to the bed and let him collapse onto it. "Stay there," she ordered, as if he had any choice in the matter. She went back outside, and he heard her moving around, unhitching her horses, speaking to them in a low voice. Then she returned with a bag from her wagon and set about taking over his cabin with the same efficiency she had shown in everything else. She got his old stove going and set water to boil. She found his sparse collection of food supplies and started making something that smelled infinitely better than anything he had managed to cook in weeks. She moved around his cabin like she owned it, and Frank found he lacked the energy to object. The fever had him in its grip again, making everything distant and strange. At some point, she returned to the bed and started unlacing his boots. "I can do that," he protested. "You cannot even lift your head," Margaret said. She pulled off his boots, then his socks, and made a disapproving sound. "When did you last change these?" Frank did not answer because he honestly could not remember. Margaret disappeared again and returned with a basin of warm water and a cloth. She washed his feet with brisk, impersonal efficiency that somehow made the intimacy of it less embarrassing. Then she moved to his hands, cleaning away the dirt and blood from broken blisters he had not bothered to tend. "You are going to lose this ranch if you keep on this way," she said as she worked. "Not because the land is bad, but because you will die and there will be nobody left to work it." "I know," Frank admitted. The words came easier in his fevered state, bypassing the pride that would normally keep such admissions locked away. "But I do not know how to stop. Every time I rest, I think about everything that needs doing, and I cannot just lie there knowing it all." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened slightly. "How long have you been alone here?" "My father died 2 years ago, consumption. My mother died when I was 12. There was a sister, but she married a merchant and moved to San Francisco. We do not talk much." He felt like he was confessing sins to a priest. "I had a hired hand for a while, but I could not afford to keep paying him after the drought started. Lost half the herd last winter. The creek dried up this summer. The mines want the land, keep sending men to make offers, but I cannot sell. This is all I have of them, my family. So you are working yourself to death out of loyalty to dead people? Margaret said. It should have sounded harsh, but her tone was surprisingly gentle. They would not want this for you? You do not know what they would want? I know that no parent wants their child to die for a piece of land, she said. She wrung out the cloth and pressed it against his forehead. No matter how much that land meant to them? Frank wanted to argue, but the cool cloth felt too good and the fever was pulling him down into darkness again. He fought it for a moment, suddenly aware that he was letting a complete stranger take over his home. Why are you doing this? He managed to ask. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because someone did it for me once, she finally said, when I needed it. Now sleep. We will talk more when you are not half dead. He slept. Not the fitful, troubled sleep he had been managing for weeks, but deep, heavy sleep that pulled him down into dreamless darkness. When he woke, the light through the window had changed, suggesting hours had passed. The cabin smelled like food and cleanliness, two scents that had been absent for far too long. Margaret sat in his one good chair, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. She had removed her hat, and he could see her hair was lighter than he had first thought, with strands of honey gold mixed in with the darker blonde. She looked up as he stirred. There is soup, she said, and bread. Though it is store-bought, your supplies are abysmal. I have been meaning to get to town, Frank said. His voice came out as a croak, and she immediately poured water from a pitcher and brought it to him. He drank gratefully, realizing he could not remember the last time he had properly hydrated. When you finish that water, you will eat, Margaret said. It was not a suggestion. Then you will tell me what absolutely must be done on this ranch in the next few days, and I will help you do it. You do not have to do that. No, I do not, she agreed. But I am going to anyway. I was heading to Butte to take a position at the miners' hospital, but I sent word yesterday that I would be delayed. They can manage without me for a little while longer. You sent word? How? There is a homestead about 5 miles south of here. A family named Patterson. They had a boy heading into town, and I gave him a message to deliver. She said this as though it was perfectly normal for her to know about neighbors that Frank had barely spoken to in 2 years. He struggled to sit up and this time managed it without the world spinning too badly. Margaret brought him soup in a chipped bowl, and he ate it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through him. It was simple fare, just vegetables and a bit of salt pork, but it tasted like the finest meal he had ever eaten. The well needs finishing, he said between bites. The cattle need to be moved to the north pasture where there is still some grass. The fence line on the eastern edge is down in 3 places. The barn roof needs patching before the next rain. Stop, Margaret said, holding up a hand. I asked what must be done in the next few days. The well can wait. The barn roof can wait. We will move the cattle and fix the fence line, and that is all. The rest can happen after you have recovered. I do not have time to recover, Frank said. You do not understand. Every day that goes by, this place slips a little further. I can feel it dying. Margaret set down her sewing and fixed him with a look that reminded him of his old school teacher, the one who could quiet a room of rowdy boys with a single glance. Listen to me very carefully, Frank Xavier. This land has survived droughts and winters and every hardship Montana can throw at it for decades. It will survive a few more days. What it will not survive is you dying and leaving it empty. Do you understand? He wanted to argue, but the truth of her words settled over him like a weight. He had been so focused on keeping the ranch alive that he had never stopped to consider what would happen if he actually died. The mines would buy it at auction for pennies on the dollar. His sister had no interest in ranching. Everything his family had built would simply cease to exist. I understand, he said quietly. Good, Margaret said. She picked up her sewing again. Now finish your soup and go back to sleep. Tomorrow we will see about moving those cattle. Frank wanted to protest that he should be up and working right now, that every minute of rest was a minute wasted, but his body had other ideas. The food sat warm in his stomach, the cabin was clean and peaceful, and Margaret's presence was oddly reassuring. He found his eyes drifting closed despite his best efforts. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked again, fighting sleep. "You do not know me." Margaret did not look up from her mending. "Maybe I'm tired of watching people destroy themselves," she said. "Maybe I see something in this place worth saving. Or maybe I am just a foolish woman who does not know when to mind her own business. Does it matter?" "I suppose not," Frank admitted. Then sleep took him again. He woke before dawn, the way he always did, his body trained by years of ranching to rise with the sun. For a moment he forgot about Margaret and started to get up, ready to begin another grueling day. Then he smelled coffee and remembered. She was already up, dressed in the same brown traveling dress, her hair pinned up neatly. She had found his coffee pot and made a brew that was far better than anything he had managed recently. She poured him a cup and brought it to the bed along with a plate of fried eggs and the last of the bread. "Eat," she said. "Then we will see about those cattle." Frank ate, and though his body still felt weak and his head still ached, the fever had broken during the night. He felt almost human again, which was more than he could say for the past few weeks. When he finished, he stood carefully, relieved when his legs held him. "I should clean up first," he said, suddenly aware of how he must look and smell after days of hard labor and fever. "There is water warming on the stove," Margaret said. "I will see to your horses while you make yourself presentable." It was strange having someone else take charge of his life this way. Frank had been alone and independent for so long that accepting help felt like admitting defeat. But as he washed and changed into clean clothes that Margaret had apparently laundered while he slept, he had to admit it felt good to be taken care of, even if it was by a near stranger. By the time he emerged from the cabin, Margaret had his 2 horses saddled and ready. She had also saddled one of her own horses, a sturdy mare that looked like it could handle rough terrain. She wore split riding skirts now instead of the dress, and he realized she had come prepared for anything. "You ride?" he asked, which was a stupid question given the evidence in front of him. "I grew up in Pennsylvania," Margaret said. "My father bred horses. I could ride before I could properly walk, according to family legend." She swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, and Frank found himself reassessing everything he had assumed about this proper Eastern nurse. They rode out to where the cattle were grazing on land that was more dust than grass. Frank had 40 head left of what had once been a herd of nearly 100. They were scraggly and thin, but they were alive, which was something. The north pasture was 2 miles away, where a spring still provided water and a stand of cottonwoods offered shade. Moving cattle was always a challenge, but Frank was surprised to discover that Margaret knew what she was doing. She positioned herself on the flank, keeping the herd moving in the right direction, anticipating their movements with the skill of someone who had done this before. It took most of the morning, but they got the cattle settled in the better pasture, where they immediately began grazing with renewed enthusiasm. "Your father bred horses, you said?" Frank asked as they rode back toward the ranch. "Among other things," Margaret said. "We had a small farm outside Philadelphia. Not a ranch like this, but enough land to keep horses, some cattle, chickens. I learned to handle animals young." Her voice had gone slightly distant, and he sensed there was more to that story. "What brought you west?" he asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "My father died 3 years ago," she finally said. Heart gave out. "My mother followed him 6 months later. The farm went to my older brother, who promptly sold it to pay his gambling debts. I had trained as a nurse, so I had a profession, but Philadelphia held too many memories. I wanted to start fresh somewhere new." "I am sorry," Frank said, and meant it, "about your parents." "Thank you," Margaret said. "It is strange how quickly a whole life can disappear. One day you have a home and family, and the next you are alone in the world trying to figure out who you are without them." "Yes," Frank said quietly, "it is strange." They looked at each other, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. They were both orphans, both alone, both fighting to build something from the wreckage of what they had lost. It created a connection that Frank had not expected, a sense of kinship with this strange woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he had not known he was praying. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Margaret stayed, sleeping in the cabin while Frank rigged up a simple tent outside for himself, claiming he needed the fresh air. She cooked and cleaned and took over the household tasks that Frank had been neglecting, but she also rode out with him each day to work on the fence line, to check on the cattle, to do the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. She was not afraid of hard work, which Frank quickly learned. She could dig post holes and string wire and handle a hammer with surprising competence. When he asked where she learned such things, she shrugged and said, "My brother was useless, so someone had to help my father. That someone was usually me." They talked as they worked, exchanging stories of their lives. Frank learned that Margaret was 24, that she had wanted to be a nurse since she was 10 years old, and saw a doctor save her younger sister's life, that she had opinions about everything from politics to philosophy and was not shy about sharing them. She was intelligent and capable, and completely unlike any woman he had known in his limited experience. Margaret learned that Frank had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, that he loved books but rarely had time to read anymore, that he played the harmonica but only when he thought no one could hear, that he had a dry sense of humor buried under layers of exhaustion and worry. She coaxed these things out of him slowly, like drawing water from a reluctant well. On the 4th day of her stay, they were working on the fence line when Frank felt his strength give out. He had been pushing too hard again, doing too much too soon, and his body reminded him that he had not fully recovered. He sat down heavily on a rock, and Margaret immediately stopped what she was doing. "That is enough for today," she said firmly. "We are almost done with this section," Frank protested. "And it will still be here tomorrow," Margaret said. She walked over and stood in front of him, hands on her hips. "You are exhausted. I can see it in every line of your body. We are going back to the cabin and you are going to rest." "I have rested. I feel better." "Better is not the same as well," Margaret said. "You worked yourself sick, Frank. That does not heal in 4 days. You need time." "I do not have time," he said, frustrated. "Every day costs money I do not have. Every day the ranch gets harder to save. I cannot just stop." "Why not?" Margaret asked. The question was so simple, so direct, that it stopped him cold. What would happen if you stopped for a week, a month? Would the world end? "The ranch might," Frank said. "Or it might not," Margaret countered. "You have cattle in good pasture with water. You have fences that are good enough for now. You have a roof over your head and food in your larder. What more do you need immediately?" "You do not understand," Frank said. "This is all I have. If I lose it, I have nothing." Margaret sat down on the rock next to him. "I understand better than you think," she said quietly. "I lost everything, remember? The farm, my family, the life I thought I would have. And you know what I learned? Things are just things. Land is just land. What matters is being alive to build something new." "This is not just land," Frank said. "It is my family's legacy." "Your family's legacy is you," Margaret said. She turned to look at him, and he was struck by the intensity in her gray eyes. "You are their legacy, living and healthy and building a life, not dead in a field somewhere because you could not let go of pride." The words hit him like a physical blow, mostly because they were true. He had been so focused on the ranch as a monument to his parents, to his grandparents, that he had forgotten he was supposed to be living, not just surviving. When had work become punishment instead of purpose? "I do not know how to do anything else," he admitted. "I have been working this land since I was 8 years old. It is all I know." "Then learn something new," Margaret said. "Learn to rest. Learn to accept help. Learn that you do not have to carry everything alone." She paused, then added more softly, "Learn that sometimes the best thing you can do is let someone else care for you." Frank looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the capable nurse, or the skilled rider, or the woman who had taken over his cabin and his life with startling efficiency. He saw someone who had been broken by loss and rebuilt herself into something stronger, someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival, someone who had chosen to help him when she had every reason to keep writing. Why do you care, he asked, about me, about this ranch? Why does it matter to you? Margaret smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious face into something beautiful. Maybe because I see what it could be, she said. This ranch, with proper care and rest and someone not trying to do everything alone, it could thrive. And maybe, I suppose, I see what you could be too, if you stop trying to work yourself to death. And what is that? Happy, she said simply. You could be happy. The word felt foreign, like something from another language. When was the last time Frank had been happy? Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely happy. He could not remember. They sat together on that rock for a long time, watching the sun move across the Montana sky. The land stretched around them, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. But sitting next to Margaret, Frank felt something shift inside him. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived in his chest for 2 years loosened slightly. He took a deep breath, and it did not hurt. All right, he said finally, I will rest, really rest, for a week. Margaret raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks. 10 days, Frank countered. Done, Margaret said, and held out her hand. They shook on it solemnly, like ranchers closing a cattle deal. Her hand was warm and calloused from work, and Frank found himself reluctant to let go. When they finally stood and headed back to the cabin, riding side by side, something had changed between them. The air felt charged with possibility, with the sense that they were standing on the edge of something neither of them quite understood yet. That evening, after a dinner of venison stew that Margaret had somehow conjured from his limited supplies, Frank found himself telling her about his life before his father died, about learning to rope cattle with his grandfather, about his mother's laugh, about lazy summer evenings when the work was done and his family would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out, stories he had not shared with anyone, memories he had buried under grief and duty. Margaret listened, really listened, asking questions that showed she was paying attention. She shared stories, too, about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her difficult brother and her sweet younger sister who had married well and moved to Boston, about learning to be a nurse in a time when many doctors still thought women had no place in medicine. They called us Nightingales, she said with a wry smile. After Florence Nightingale, of course. Made it sound romantic and noble. They did not mention the blood and the filth and the doctors who treated you like you were furniture. Is that why you came west? Frank asked. To get away from that? Partly, Margaret admitted, but also because I wanted to go somewhere I could be useful. The mining towns, they need doctors and nurses desperately. Men get hurt in the mines every day. They need someone who knows what they are doing. She paused. And I suppose I wanted adventure. Is that foolish? No, Frank said. I think it is brave. Margaret looked at him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. So is what you are doing, she said. Trying to keep this ranch alive against all odds. That is brave too. Maybe a bit stupid, but brave. Frank laughed, and it felt strange. He could not remember the last time he had laughed. Only a bit stupid? Perhaps more than a bit, Margaret said, but she was smiling. They stayed up late that night, talking by lamplight until they both were yawning. When Margaret finally declared it was time to sleep, Frank found himself disappointed. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to having someone to talk to, someone who understood. The cabin felt less empty with her in it, less like a place he was simply enduring and more like a home. The next morning, Frank woke to find Margaret already gone. For a moment he felt a stab of panic, thinking she had left without saying goodbye, but then he heard her voice outside. He dressed quickly and emerged to find her talking to a man on horseback. Frank Xavier, the man said. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in ranch country. I am Robert Harrison from the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. I wanted to speak with you about your land. Frank's jaw tightened. The mining company had been after his property for months, sending letters he did not answer, making offers he refused. The copper deposits on his land were valuable, he knew, but selling would mean abandoning everything his family had built. I am not interested in selling, Frank said flatly. You have not heard my offer yet, Harrison said smoothly. We are prepared to be very generous, Mr. Xavier, more than generous, enough that you could buy a smaller spread somewhere else and still have money left over to live comfortably. The answer is no, Frank said. Harrison's smile did not waver. I understand you have been having some difficulties. The drought, the loss of cattle, these are hard times for ranchers. There is no shame in accepting help. I said no, Frank repeated, his voice hard. Think about it, Harrison said. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out. Here is our official offer. I will return in a week for your answer. Frank did not take the envelope. Margaret stepped forward and accepted it instead. He will consider it, she said calmly. Thank you for coming out all this way, Mr. Harrison. The mining man looked between them, clearly trying to figure out their relationship, then tipped his hat and rode away. Frank waited until he was out of earshot before turning to Margaret. I am not considering anything, he said. Why did you tell him that? Because refusing to even look at an offer makes you seem irrational, Margaret said, which gives them ammunition to claim you are not in your right mind, which could lead to legal complications. She held up the envelope. We will look at their offer, see what they are actually proposing, and then you can make an informed decision to tell them no. Frank stared at her. You have thought about this. I have worked in mining towns long enough to know how the companies operate, Margaret said. They do not give up easily. Better to know what you are dealing with. She tucked the envelope into her pocket. But that is a problem for later. Today you're resting, remember? We had a deal. She was right, of course. Frank allowed himself to be herded back into the cabin where Margaret had breakfast waiting. It felt strange, sitting idle while there was work to be done, but he had promised. Instead, he found himself watching Margaret as she moved around the cabin and realizing that somewhere in the past week she had become essential to his daily life. The next 10 days passed in a strange, peaceful haze. Frank rested, really rested, for the first time in 2 years. He read books that had been gathering dust on his shelf. He played his harmonica in the evenings while Margaret did mending or prepared meals. They talked about everything and nothing, building a friendship that felt as natural as breathing. Margaret also started making improvements to the cabin that Frank had been too busy or too tired to consider. She sewed curtains for the windows from fabric she purchased on a trip to town. She organized his chaotic supplies into something resembling order. She brought back seeds from town and started a small kitchen garden near the cabin, insisting that they needed fresh vegetables. This land does not want to be a ranch, she announced one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The soil is too poor, the water too scarce, but you know what it could be? What? Frank asked, curious. A horse ranch, Margaret said. Smaller than what you have now, but better. You have good grazing in that north pasture. The spring provides water year-round. Horses need less acreage than cattle and sell for better prices. You could raise working horses for the mines, riding horses for the ranches, breeding stock. Frank had not considered that. He had always assumed the ranch would continue as it had been, cattle and crops and constant struggle. But Margaret was right. The land was better suited for horses. And horses were his passion anyway, more than cattle had ever been. That would take money to start, he said slowly. Good breeding stock, building proper facilities. It would, Margaret agreed, which brings us back to that envelope from Mr. Harrison. They had looked at the mining company's offer a few days earlier. It was generous. More than generous. Enough to pay off the debts Frank had accumulated, buy quality horses, build what he needed, and still have money left over. But it meant giving up 200 acres of his land, including the eastern pastures where the copper deposits lay richest. I do not want to sell, Frank said, not to them. Then do not sell all of it, Margaret said. Sell just the mineral rights to the copper deposits. Keep the surface land for grazing. Get the money you need, but do not give up the ranch itself. Frank looked at her. Can you do that? Yes, Margaret said. It is done all the time in Pennsylvania with coal. You retain ownership of the land itself. They pay you for the right to extract what is underneath. You would have to deal with some mining operations nearby, but you would keep your ranch and get the capital you need to change it into something sustainable. The idea had never occurred to Frank. He had seen the choice as all or nothing, sell everything or keep everything. Margaret had found a middle path, a compromise that let him honor his family's legacy while also adapting to reality. "How do you know so much about this?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "My useless brother got involved in a mining venture once. I spent a great deal of time reading contracts and trying to understand what he was getting into. It did not end well for him, but I learned things." She paused. "You should have a lawyer look at any agreement before you sign it, a good one, not someone in the mining company's pocket." "That costs money," Frank pointed out. "So does losing your ranch," Margaret said. "I have some savings. I can loan you enough for a lawyer." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking. I am offering." She turned to face him fully. "Frank, I have been here 2 weeks, and in that time, I have watched you start to come back to life. You are eating properly, sleeping properly, smiling again. This ranch can work if you let yourself change it into something new. Let me help you do that." Frank wanted to argue, to refuse, to insist that he had to do this alone the way he had done everything alone. But looking at Margaret, seeing the determination and the hope in her eyes, he could not bring himself to push her away. She had appeared in his life at the moment he needed her most, and maybe that meant something. Maybe it was time to stop being so damn stubborn. "All right," he said, "we will talk to a lawyer, see what kind of deal we can negotiate with the mining company." Margaret's smile was radiant. "Good," she said. "I will send a telegram to Helena tomorrow. I know a lawyer there who specializes in land contracts. He owes me a favor after I patched up his son last year." Of course she knew a lawyer. Of course he owed her a favor. Frank found himself smiling despite his lingering worries. Margaret Brennan was a force of nature, and he was beginning to realize that having her on his side was the best thing that had happened to him in a very long time. That night, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Frank finally asked the question that had been building in him for days. "When are you planning to leave?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I should get to Butte soon," she said slowly. "They are expecting me at the hospital." "Right," Frank said, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. "Of course." "Unless," Margaret said, and then stopped. "Unless what?" She turned to look at him, and even in the dim light from the lamp inside, he could see the uncertainty in her expression. Margaret, who was never uncertain about anything. "Unless you wanted me to stay," she said. "Not forever, necessarily, but for a while. Until we get this situation with the mining company sorted out, until the ranch is more stable, until you do not need help anymore." Frank's heart was pounding. "And if I wanted you to stay longer than that?" Margaret's breath caught. "How much longer?" "I do not know," Frank admitted. "I just know that the thought of you leaving makes this place feel empty again. These past 2 weeks, having you here, it has been good. Better than good. I look forward to waking up because I know you will be there. I look forward to evening because we will sit and talk. I do not want it to end." "Frank," Margaret said softly. "Margaret, I know it is selfish," he continued, words spilling out now. "You have your own life, your own plans. You're supposed to be at the hospital in Butte helping people. I have no right to ask you to give that up to stay here with me, but I am asking anyway because this feels important." Margaret stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the darkened land. Frank watched her, his heart in his throat, wondering if he had just ruined everything by being too honest too soon. "When I first saw you lying in that yard," Margaret finally said, "I thought you were just another man who needed help. I stopped because I am a nurse, and that is what I do. But then I started talking to you, learning about you, and I realized you were different. You were not trying to dominate this land or conquer it. You were trying to belong to it, to be part of it. That is rare." She turned back to face him. "And then, somewhere in all the work and the talking and the planning, I realized I did not want to leave either. I have been telling myself it was because the project was not finished, the ranch was not stable yet. But that is not really why." She took a breath. I like being here. With you. I like who I am when I am here. I feel useful and needed, and like I am building something real, not just patching up broken men in a hospital only to send them back down into the mines to break themselves again. Frank stood, closing the distance between them. So stay, he said. Please, we will figure out the details. We will make it work somehow. Just stay. I barely know you, Margaret said, but there was no conviction in her words. Then get to know me better, Frank said. I am pretty simple. I like horses and books and sleeping more than 5 hours a night. I am learning to rest. I am learning that asking for help is not weakness. I am learning that maybe I do not have to do everything alone. Margaret laughed, a soft, trembling sound. When you put it that way. Is that a yes? It is a maybe leaning toward yes, Margaret said. Let me send word to the hospital that I'm taking a position as a private nurse for a stubborn rancher who does not know when to quit. They will understand. Private positions pay better anyway, and heaven knows you need someone to keep you from working yourself to death again. I would pay you if I could, Frank said seriously. I do not have much now. But once we work out this mining situation, once the horse ranch is established, Margaret put a finger to his lips, silencing him. I did not say I was staying for the money. Frank? Then why? She smiled. Because maybe I want to build something too. And maybe I want to build it with you. The kiss was inevitable, something that had been building between them since the moment she pressed her cool hand against his fevered forehead. Frank leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not. Instead, she met him halfway, her lips soft against his, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they pulled apart, Frank felt like he was standing on solid ground for the first time in years. Margaret's eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed, and she was smiling in a way that made his breath catch. So you were staying, Frank said. I am staying, Margaret confirmed. They sealed it with another kiss, longer this time, and Frank felt the last of the tension that had been living in his shoulders for 2 years finally release. He was not alone anymore. Alone. He had help. He had a plan. And he had this remarkable woman who had appeared in his life like a miracle. The lawyer from Helena, a sharp-minded man named Thomas Greer, arrived 3 days later. Margaret had been right about him owing her a favor. His son had nearly died from infection after a mining accident, and Margaret's nursing had saved his life. Greer listened to Frank's situation, examined the mining company's offer, and spent a day surveying the land to understand what they were working with. You have leverage, Greer announced over dinner that evening. The copper deposits on your land are rich, and they connect to the main vein the Anaconda Company is mining on the adjacent property. They need access to your copper to maximize their operation. That means you can negotiate from a position of strength. What are you suggesting? Frank asked. Sell the mineral rights, not the land itself, Greer said. Retain surface rights for grazing and any structures. Negotiate for a percentage of the copper profits in addition to an upfront payment. And insist on environmental protections so their mining operations do not contaminate your water supply or destroy grazing land. Will they agree to that? Margaret asked. They will if they want the copper badly enough, Greer said. And trust me, they do. I will handle the negotiations. This is what I do. It took another 2 weeks of back and forth, with Greer traveling between the ranch and the mining company offices in Butte, but eventually they had a deal. Frank sold the mineral rights to the copper deposits for a substantial upfront payment plus 10% of the net profits from copper extracted from his land. He retained complete ownership of the surface land and negotiated strong protections for his water sources and grazing areas. The day the papers were signed and the first payment arrived, Frank stood in his cabin holding a bank draft for more money than he had seen in his life. Margaret stood beside him reading the contract one more time to make sure everything was in order. You did it, she said quietly. You saved the ranch without giving up who you are or what your family built. We did it, Frank corrected. I could not have done this without you. I would be dead in a field somewhere if you had not stopped. Margaret smiled. Well, then I suppose it is fortunate I was passing through at exactly the right moment. Do you believe in fate? Frank asked. She considered the question. I believe in choices, she said. I chose to stop when I saw you collapsed. You chose to accept help. We both chose this. She gestured around the cabin, indicating not just the building, but everything it represented, whatever this is becoming. And what is it becoming? Frank asked. Margaret stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. I think it is becoming a home, she said. A real one. Not just a place to work yourself to death, but a place to live and grow and build a future. She paused. Together if you want that. I want that, Frank said without hesitation. I want you here, not as a nurse or an employee or a temporary help. I want you as my partner in the ranch, in life, in everything. Is that a proposal, Frank Xavier? Margaret asked, her eyes sparkling with amusement and something deeper. It is the beginning of one, Frank said. I am not doing this properly, I know. I should have a ring and flowers and some romantic setting, but I do not want to wait. These past few weeks with you have been the best of my life. You made me want to live again, not just survive. You gave me hope when I had none. And I love you. I know it is fast. I know we are still learning each other. But I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that every day. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. Yes. Yes to partnership. Yes to building a life together. Yes to everything. They kissed there in the cabin, surrounded by contracts and bank drafts and the evidence of their shared victory. It felt like a beginning, like standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful and terrifying. They married a month later in a simple ceremony in Butte, with Thomas Greer and his wife as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue fabric that brought out her eyes, and Frank wore his father's good suit, carefully mended and cleaned. They spoke vows in a small church, promising to love and honor and support each other through whatever came. The Pattersons, the neighboring family, came to the wedding and brought food for a small celebration afterward. Frank learned that they had been worried about him for months, watching his slow deterioration, but had not known how to help. They were grateful to Margaret for stepping in when she did. You saved his life, Mrs. Patterson said, embracing Margaret after the ceremony. We all saw it. He was killing himself out there. He saved himself, Margaret said, glancing at Frank across the room. I just reminded him how. With the money from the mining company, Frank and Margaret began transforming the ranch. They bought 6 good mares and 2 stallions from a breeder in Wyoming, the foundation of their horse herd. They built a proper stable with room to expand. Designed by Margaret with an eye toward efficiency and the horses' comfort, they hired 2 ranch hands, brothers who had experience with horses and needed work. The copper mining on the eastern part of the property continued as agreed, but the operations were far enough from the main ranch that they rarely interfered with daily life. The quarterly profit payments provided a steady income that supplemented what they earned from breeding and selling horses. Margaret established a small clinic in one of the ranch buildings, treating neighbors and ranch hands and occasionally traveling to Butte to help at the hospital during emergencies. She had found a way to practice nursing while also building the ranch, and she thrived with the balance. Frank flourished under her care and partnership. He put on healthy weight, lost the gaunt, haunted look he had worn for so long, and rediscovered his love for the work. Breeding horses was different from raising cattle, requiring patience and knowledge and a careful eye. He was good at it, and with Margaret's help, their reputation grew. By their first anniversary, they had sold 12 horses for good prices and had inquiries from as far as Denver. The ranch was profitable and sustainable, everything Frank had hoped for but never dared to believe possible. They celebrated their anniversary with a picnic by the spring in the north pasture, surrounded by horses grazing peacefully in the late summer sun. Margaret had packed a basket with food, and they sat on a blanket talking about the past year and their plans for the future. I want to expand the stable, Frank said, Build an indoor training arena so we can work with horses year-round, even in winter." "That is a good idea," Margaret agreed. "And I was thinking we could add a few milk cows. Fresh milk and butter would be nice." "Whatever you want," Frank said, reaching over to take her hand. "I still cannot believe this is real sometimes. That you are here, that we built this together." "Believe it," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "This is as real as it gets." She had news, something she had been holding close for a few weeks, waiting for the right moment. Their anniversary seemed perfect. "Frank," she said carefully, "how do you feel about children?" He looked at her, startled. "Children? I mean, I always assumed we would have them eventually. Why?" Margaret smiled. "Because eventually is coming sooner than you might think. I am pregnant." Frank's expression went through several rapid changes: shock, confusion, understanding, and finally pure joy. "You are? We are? We are going to have a baby?" "Yes," Margaret said, laughing at his reaction. "Around February, the doctor thinks." Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he repeated, awed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Frank said. He pulled back just enough to kiss her, soft and reverent. "Thank you for everything. For stopping that day, for staying, for building this life with me, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." "Right back at you," Margaret said, her eyes bright with tears. "You gave me a home when I had none, a purpose, a future." They sat together by the spring as the sun moved across the sky, making plans and dreaming out loud about the child who would join them. They argued playfully about names, about whether they wanted a boy or a girl, about all the ways they would raise their child to love this land and this life they had built together. Winter came, and with it the challenges of ranching in Montana's harsh climate. But the ranch was prepared this time, with ample supplies and proper shelter for the horses. Frank had learned to pace himself, to rest when he needed rest, to ask for help when he needed help. Margaret continued to amaze him with her capabilities, managing the household and her clinic and her pregnancy with equal competence. Their son was born on a snowy February morning, with the ranch hands nervously pacing outside and Frank holding Margaret's hand through every contraction. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Frank felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. "He is perfect," he whispered, watching Margaret cradle their son against her chest. "He looks like you," Margaret said, tracing the baby's features with one gentle finger. "Same nose, same stubborn chin." They named him Samuel, after Frank's grandfather, and he became the center of their world. Frank had worried he would not know how to be a father, but it came naturally, surprisingly so. He loved holding his son, singing to him, showing him the horses even though Samuel was too young to understand. Margaret thrived as a mother, balancing the demands of a newborn with the needs of the ranch without complaint. She had help from Mrs. Patterson and the wives of their ranch hands, women who had become friends over the past year. The ranch had become not just a workplace but a community, something Frank had never expected but deeply appreciated. Samuel's first year passed in a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles and tiny milestones. Frank documented each one in a journal Margaret had given him, wanting to remember everything. His son would know his history, know the story of how this ranch had nearly died and been reborn, know that love and partnership and stubbornness could overcome almost anything. By Samuel's second birthday, the ranch was thriving. They had expanded the herd to 20 horses and were known throughout Montana for producing quality working horses and riding stock. The mining profits continued to supplement their income, and they had saved enough to weather any future hardships. Frank and Margaret stood on their porch one evening, watching Samuel play in the yard with a puppy they had recently acquired. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the land stretched around them peaceful and productive. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked quietly. Staying here instead of going to Butte? You could have had a career at the hospital, helped so many more people. Margaret leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm. I help plenty of people, she said. The neighbors, the ranch hands, you, and I have this. She gestured at the ranch, at Samuel, at everything they had built. I have a family and a home and a life I love. No regrets, Frank, not a single one. Good, Urissa, Frank said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, because I have enough love and happiness here to last several lifetimes. Just several? Margaret teased. At least a dozen, Frank amended, and she laughed. Samuel ran up to them, the puppy yipping at his heels, and Frank scooped his son up into his arms. The boy was sturdy and healthy, with Margaret's intelligence in his eyes and Frank's love for horses already evident in the way he insisted on visiting the stable every day. Dada horses? Samuel asked hopefully. Tomorrow, Frank promised. Right now it is time for dinner and bed. Samuel pouted, but allowed himself to be carried inside, chattering about horses and puppies in the way of toddlers everywhere. Margaret followed, pausing at the door to look back at the land one more time. She thought about the day she had first arrived here, seeing a man collapsed in his yard, working himself to death out of misplaced loyalty and desperate fear. She thought about how close Frank had come to losing everything, including his life. And she thought about the miracle of timing that had brought her here at exactly the moment she was needed most. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just luck, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever force had led her down that road at that precise moment, Margaret was grateful for it. She had found a home here, a purpose, a love that completed her in ways she had never expected. Inside, Frank was getting Samuel settled at the table, and she joined them, sliding naturally into the rhythm of family life. They ate dinner together, talking about the day and making plans for tomorrow. They put Samuel to bed, reading him stories until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted off to sleep. Later, lying in bed with Frank's arms around her, Margaret felt completely at peace. The ranch outside was quiet, the horses settled in their stable, the land resting under the stars. Everything they had fought for, everything they had built together, was real and solid and theirs. I love you, Frank murmured against her hair, half asleep. I love you too, Margaret replied. Thank you for letting me save you. Thank you for saving me, Frank said, and thank you for letting me save you right back. It was true, Margaret realized. They had saved each other. Frank had given her a place to belong when she had been adrift, a purpose beyond just patching up broken bodies. She had given him a reason to live when he had been drowning in despair and overwork. Together, they had created something neither could have managed alone. Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and children and the growth of their horse ranch. Margaret gave birth to a daughter 2 years after Samuel, a bright-eyed girl they named Clara, who grew up fearless and wild, riding horses before she could properly walk. Another son followed 3 years later, quieter than his siblings, but with a gift for understanding horses that reminded everyone of Frank. The ranch expanded gradually, carefully, never growing faster than they could manage. Frank had learned that lesson well. They hired more hands as needed, built a second stable, added cattle back into the mix, but on a much smaller scale. The mining company continued to extract copper from the eastern property, providing steady supplemental income that gave them security and options. Frank never worked himself sick again. He had learned to delegate, to rest, to trust others with responsibilities. Margaret watched him flourish into the man he was meant to be: confident, capable, happy. The haunted look that had driven him to collapse in his own yard never returned. Margaret continued her nursing work, though more selectively as their children grew. She taught other women in the area basic medical skills, creating a network of caregivers who could help when the doctor was too far away or unavailable. She wrote articles for medical journals about frontier nursing, sharing what she had learned about combining profession with family life. Their children grew up strong and loved, learning to work hard but also to rest, to value partnership and community, to understand that asking for help was strength, not weakness. Samuel took to horses naturally and became his father's partner in the breeding operation. Clara wanted to be a veterinarian, an ambitious goal for a young woman, but one her parents supported without question. The youngest, Michael, showed an interest in the business side of ranching, already keeping meticulous records of expenses and profits at age 10. When Samuel turned 18, Frank and Margaret gathered their children together and told them the full story of how the ranch had almost died and been reborn. They explained Frank's near collapse, Margaret's fortuitous arrival, the hard decisions that had saved everything. The children listened with wide eyes, understanding for the first time how close they had come to a completely different life. The point, Frank said, is that stubbornness is not strength. Accepting help is not weakness, and sometimes the best thing you can do is admit you need someone else. Also, Margaret added, that love can save you when nothing else can. The children absorbed this, nodding seriously. They had grown up in a house full of love and partnership, where their parents made decisions together and supported each other through every challenge. It was their normal, but hearing how hard one that normal had been gave them new appreciation for it. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Frank arranged a surprise for Margaret. He had commissioned a painter to create a portrait of their family, and he unveiled it at a party they threw for friends and neighbors. The painting showed all 5 of them standing in front of the ranch house, horses grazing in the background, the Montana landscape stretching to the horizon behind them. Margaret cried when she saw it, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of joy and gratitude that came from seeing her entire life captured in paint and canvas. This was her family, her home, her legacy, everything she had dreamed of and so much more. "Do you remember what you said to me that first week?" Frank asked, holding her hand as they studied the painting together. "You said I could be happy. That seemed impossible then." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now it seems inevitable," Frank said. "Because of you. Because you refused to let me give up, on the ranch or on myself." "We saved each other," Margaret reminded him, echoing words from years ago. "That is what partners do." They danced that night under the Montana stars, surrounded by family and friends, and the community they had helped build. The ranch stretched around them, prosperous and peaceful, a testament to what could be achieved through love and partnership and refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. Frank pulled Margaret close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. He thought about the man he had been 15 years ago, desperate, exhausted, dying by inches in his own front yard. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. "Thank you," he whispered against her ear, "for stopping that day, for staying, for everything." Margaret pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "You know what the best part is?" she asked. "What?" "We get to do this for the rest of our lives," she said. "Grow old together, watch our children build their own lives, maybe meet grandchildren someday, all of it together." "That is the best part," Frank agreed, and kissed her under the stars while their children laughed and their friends cheered and the horses nickered softly in the distance. The years continued their steady march forward. Samuel married a school teacher from Butte and brought her to live on the ranch, building a small house on the northern edge of the property. Clara went east to study veterinary medicine, one of the first women accepted into the program, and returned 3 years later with a degree and a fierce determination to help animals throughout Montana. Michael took over the business management of the ranch, modernizing their record-keeping and finding new markets for their horses. Frank and Margaret watched their children flourish, seeing pieces of themselves in each one, but also seeing the unique individuals they had become. They had done this, created these capable, confident young people who knew how to work hard and love deeply and support each other through anything. Grandchildren followed, as Margaret had predicted. Samuel and his wife had twins, boy and girl, who spent every spare moment in the stables learning about horses from their grandfather. Clara, after much internal debate, married a fellow veterinarian she had met during her studies and had a son who showed early signs of inheriting his mother's fearless nature. Even Michael eventually settled down with a widow from town who had 2 children of her own, blending families with surprising ease. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with wings added for the grandchildren to stay when they visited. Holiday gatherings became major productions, with 3 generations crowded around the dining table Frank had built with his own hands decades ago. Margaret presided over these gatherings with quiet satisfaction, watching her family laugh and argue and love each other with the fierce loyalty she and Frank had modeled from the beginning. As Frank approached 50, he started teaching Samuel more and more of the day-to-day operations, preparing to step back from the endless work that had once nearly killed him. He still rode every day, still checked on the horses, still made the major decisions, but he also took afternoons off to read or play with his grandchildren or simply sit with Margaret on the porch watching the sun set over land they had fought so hard to keep. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not stopped that day?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat together, her head resting on his shoulder. "I would be dead," Frank said simply. "The ranch would have been sold to the mining company. My family's legacy would have ended with me." "It is strange to think how much can change in a single moment," Margaret mused. "If I had decided to push on to Butte instead of stopping, if I had not been a nurse and known you were dying, if I had not been stubborn enough to force you to accept help." "I prefer to think of it as fate," Frank said. "You were exactly where you needed to be, when you needed to be there. We both were." Margaret smiled. "Maybe so, or maybe we just made good choices. Either way, I am grateful for how it turned out." "So am I," Frank said. "Every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across their land. The sounds of the ranch surrounded them, horses moving in the stable, cattle lowing in the distance, one of the dogs barking at something only it could see. These were the sounds of home, of a life well lived, of everything they had built together from near destruction. On their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half of Montana. The ranch was packed with friends and neighbors and business associates, all there to celebrate a love story that had become somewhat legendary in the area. The stubborn rancher, who nearly worked himself to death, and the Eastern nurse who saved him, had become a tale people told, embellishing with each retelling but always keeping the core truth intact. Frank gave a speech that evening, standing on the porch of the ranch house with Margaret beside him, and their entire family spread out before them. 20 years ago, he began, I was dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but inch by inch, day by day, working myself into an early grave because I could not imagine another way. And then this woman appeared, stubborn and capable and entirely unwilling to let me give up. She saved my life, and then she helped me build a life worth saving. Everything you see here, this ranch, these horses, our family exists because she refused to let me die in my own front yard. He turned to Margaret, taking both her hands in his. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for staying. Thank you for everything. Margaret was crying, but she was also smiling. You saved me too, she said. Maybe not as dramatically, but just as completely. I was adrift before I found this place, before I found you. You gave me a home and a purpose and a family. So, thank you right back. They kissed while everyone cheered, and if Frank's knees were a bit creaky now, and Margaret's hair showed strands of silver, neither of them cared. They had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and partnership and refusing to give up even when giving up seemed inevitable. The years continued. Frank's hair turned fully gray, then white. Margaret developed arthritis in her hands but refused to stop her medical work, adapting her techniques to accommodate the pain. They moved slower now, tired faster, but their love remained as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered decades of challenges together. Their golden anniversary approached, 50 years of marriage that seemed impossible and yet entirely natural. The family planned another massive party, but Frank had a different idea. He wanted to recreate their first meeting, or at least acknowledge it properly. So, on the actual day of their anniversary before the party that evening, Frank took Margaret out to the exact spot where he had collapsed 50 years earlier. The land looked different now, better maintained, more prosperous, with new buildings and healthy horses and all the evidence of their success. But the spot itself was the same, and they stood there together remembering. "I saw you lying there," Margaret said softly, "and my first thought was that you were already dead. You looked like a corpse." "I was not far from it," Frank admitted. "Another day or two and I would have been." "But I stopped," Margaret said. "Something made me stop and check. Call it instinct, call it fate, call it whatever you want. I stopped." "And I'm grateful every day that you did," Frank said. He was 76 years old now, his body marked by decades of ranch work, but his eyes were clear and his love unwavering. "You gave me everything, Margaret, everything that matters." "We gave it to each other," she corrected, as she always did. "That is what makes it so special." They stood together in the spot where everything had changed, where a dying man had met the woman who would save him in every way a person can be saved. Around them, the ranch bustled with activity, grandchildren and great-grandchildren running between buildings, horses being exercised in the arena, dogs barking joyfully. All of it, every bit of it, existed because Margaret Brennan had chosen to stop and check on a collapsed man in a dusty front yard 5 decades ago. The party that evening was even bigger than their 20th anniversary celebration. People came from across Montana and beyond, drawn by the remarkable love story of Frank and Margaret Xavier. Their children gave speeches, their grandchildren performed songs they had written, and their great-grandchildren simply charmed everyone by existing. When it was finally just the two of them, late in the night after everyone else had gone to bed, Frank and Margaret sat on their porch one more time. They held hands, fingers intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Montana sky. 50 years, Margaret marveled. It went so fast. And so slow, Frank added. Some days lasted forever, but looking back, it all seems like a blink. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked. Frank considered. "None about us," he said. "Maybe some business decisions I would make differently with hindsight. Maybe I should have been more patient with Samuel when he was learning. Small things. But nothing about us, nothing about the important choices." "Good," Margaret said, satisfied, "because I have no regrets either, not a single one." They sat in silence, comfortable and complete. The future stretched ahead of them, however much or little remained. They had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would carry on their legacy. They had built something that would endure long after they were gone. And most importantly, they had loved each other well and thoroughly for 50 years, never taking a single day for granted after that first desperate beginning. "Thank you," Frank said one more time, for making me rest, for making me recover, for making me live." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this life." They sat together under the stars, two souls who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built a lifetime of love from that chance encounter. The land stretched around them, alive and thriving. The family they had created slept peacefully in houses scattered across the property. And Frank and Margaret Xavier, the stubborn rancher and the determined nurse, held hands and watched the night sky and felt completely, perfectly content with everything they had built together. The ranch would continue long after them. Their children and grandchildren would preserve what Frank and Margaret had fought so hard to create. The story of how they met, how she saved him and he saved her, would be passed down through generations, becoming family legend and then family mythology. But the core truth would remain: that love can heal. That partnership can accomplish what neither person could achieve alone, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone die in their own front yard. That was their legacy, written into every fence post and horse stall and family gathering, and it all began with a single choice: to stop, to help, to care about a stranger enough to change the entire trajectory of two lives forever.